Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most essential topics in photography, exposure. If you've been struggling to understand why your photos come out too dark, too bright, or just not the way you want, then stick around. In this video, I'll break down the three main settings that control exposure: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. By the end, you'll have the confidence to control the light in your photos like a pro. Alright, let's start with the basics. Exposure simply means how much light your camera lets in to create an image. Too much light and your photo's washed out. Too little and it's too dark. Getting the right exposure is all about balancing three main settings: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, which we call the exposure triangle. Let's start with ISO. This setting controls how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. A low ISO like 100 makes the sensor less sensitive, perfect for bright sunny days. A high ISO like 1600 or 3200 makes it more sensitive, which is useful in low light but can introduce noise or grain into your photo. See the difference here? The left side with ISO 100 looks clean and sharp, but on the right with ISO 1600 we see more grain. So when possible, aim to keep your ISO low for the best image quality. Next up, we have aperture. Aperture is the opening in your lens that controls how much light enters. Think of it like the pupil of your eye. A wider aperture lets in more light, while narrower aperture lets in less. Notice how in this portrait shot at f1.8, the background is super blurry, making the subject stand out. This is called shallow depth of field, and it's popular in portrait photography. But in this landscape shot at f16, everything from the foreground to the background is in focus, which is perfect for capturing details across the whole scene. So remember, lower f-stop means more light and a blurry background, while higher f-stop means less light and everything in focus. Finally, let's talk about shutter speed. This setting controls how long your camera sensor is exposed to light. A fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, captures motion quickly, perfect for freezing action. A slower shutter speed, like 1/30th of a second, lets in more light, but can cause motion blur if the camera or subject moves. Check out these examples. The fast shutter speed freezes the motion of the subject, making it crisp and clear. But in this image, a slow shutter speed was used to create a dreamy motion blur effect. So, as a rule of thumb, if you're shooting something in motion and want it sharp, go for a fast shutter speed. For low light scenes or creative effects, try a slower shutter speed. But remember to keep your camera steady. Alright, let's bring it all together. These three settings, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, work together in what we call the exposure triangle. If you adjust one, you'll often need to adjust the others to keep a balanced exposure. Let's say you're shooting in low light. You could increase the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive, or you could use a wider aperture to let in more light, or a slower shutter speed to keep the sensor open longer. Each choice affects your image differently, so practice experimenting with all three. Let's say you're taking a portrait at sunset. You want a nice blurred background, so you set your aperture to f2.8. It's getting dark, so you bump up the ISO to 400 and keep a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second to avoid blur. With this combination, you get a well-exposed portrait with a soft background. And there you have it. Exposure doesn't have to be intimidating. It's just about understanding how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed work together to create the image you want. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe for more photography tips. And let me know in the comments, what part of exposure do you find most challenging? Again, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.